The carriage wheel cracked on the stone bridge, and Alira Bennett heard her own heartbeat before she heard the sound of splitting wood. She was 3 miles from the Whitmore estate, running behind a schedule that could not afford to slip, carrying a dress box that held someone else's future and a debt that held her own. The wheel gave out completely just past the bridge. She stepped down into the mud, looked at the broken axle, and understood in one cold breath that she was not going to make her delivery on time. She had two choices: walk the rest of the way and arrive late, which meant losing the commission and likely losing far more than that, or find another way in. A second carriage came up the road within minutes, its lanterns swinging, its horses breathing hard from the climb. A footman leaned out and called to her, mistaking her, in the dark and the rain, for someone else entirely. "Lady Hartley," he said, "you are later than we feared. The Duke has already asked for you twice." Alira opened her mouth to correct him. The words did not come. She thought of the debt collector who had been standing outside her shop that very morning, arms crossed, patient in the way that frightened her more than shouting ever could. She thought of the rent due in 4 days. She thought of the dress box in her hands, made for a woman she had never met, a baroness she had only heard described as reclusive and rarely seen in public. Lady Priscilla Hartley, who lived 2 counties away and had sent for a gown to be delivered to Duke Alaric Whitmore's estate for a private ball, one she was expected to attend as a guest of some importance. Alira looked at the footman's outstretched hand. "I am sorry for the delay," she said, and let him help her into the carriage. It was not a decision. It was a door swinging open in a storm, and she stepped through it because the alternative was standing in the rain with nothing. The estate rose out of the dark like something built to be looked at from far away. Windows glowed gold across 3 floors. Music drifted out through open doors, low and formal, the kind of music that made ordinary people feel they were intruding just by listening. Alira had sewn gowns for occasions like this one for 6 years. She had never worn one to an event like this. She had certainly never entered through the front doors, past a line of servants who bowed as she passed, as though bowing to her were the most natural thing in the world. She kept the dress box tucked under her arm like a shield. Inside, the entrance hall was brighter than any room she had ever stood in. A young woman in blue took the dress box from her without asking and disappeared toward the upper floor, presumably to prepare it for its intended wearer, whoever that might turn out to be, though Alira suspected now that intended wearer was meant to be her, for tonight, whether she liked it or not. A steward approached with a list in his hand. He glanced at it, then at her, then back at the list. "Lady Hartley," he said, "the Duke will receive you shortly. May I say, you are not at all what the description led us to expect." Alira's pulse jumped. "Descriptions rarely capture people well," she said, and was surprised at how steady her own voice sounded. The steward smiled, satisfied with the answer, and led her toward the ballroom. She had time, walking down that corridor, to consider turning back. The night was dark enough. The grounds were large enough. She could slip out a side door, find the road, and walk until she found a village willing to take pity on a stranger. It would not be the first uncomfortable night of her life. But the debt collector's face rose in her mind again, patient, waiting, certain she would fail to pay by the end of the week. And here in this house, under a false name, there was food, warmth, and one single night where nobody would ask her for money she did not have. She walked into the ballroom. The room was full of people who moved like they had rehearsed moving, each gesture practiced, each laugh timed to land at the correct moment in a conversation. Alira had dressed hundreds of women for evenings exactly like this one. She had never understood until this moment, standing in the doorway in a borrowed name, how exhausting it must be to perform grace for hours at a time. She was announced. The name that left the herald's mouth was not her own, and hearing it out loud made her stomach turn once, sharply, before settling into something colder and more focused. There was no undoing this now. She had crossed the threshold. Whatever happened next would happen to Lady Hartley, and Lady Hartley would have to survive it. A man crossed the room toward her before she had taken 3 steps into it. He moved differently than the others, without the practiced rhythm, as though he found the performance of the evening slightly tiresome and had decided not to bother pretending otherwise. He was tall, dressed simply for a duke, wearing dark blue instead of the gold and cream favored by half the room. He did not smile the way the other men had smiled at her. He looked at her the way a person looks at a puzzle they are not yet sure they want to solve. "Lady Hartley," he said, "I was told you rarely leave your estate. I confess I did not expect you to be interesting." Alira felt something dangerous rise in her chest, something close to laughter. "I could say the same of dukes," she said. "I was told you rarely speak to your guests directly. I confess I did not expect you to bother." Something shifted in his face. Surprise, then something that looked almost like relief, as though he had been waiting all evening for a single conversation that was not about weather or land or marriage prospects, and had finally found it. "Alaric," he said, offering his name the way one offers something private. "Most people call me Duke Whitmore. I find it exhausting." "Alira," she said, and caught herself half a second too late, the true name slipping out before she could stop it. She recovered quickly. "Alira is my middle name. My family has always preferred it to the first." It was a thin excuse, but he did not question it, and she understood then that people rarely questioned dukes who seemed pleased with an answer. "Alira," he repeated, testing the sound of it. "I like it better than the one on the guest list." They spoke for nearly an hour. She had expected the conversation to be difficult, full of traps she did not know how to avoid, but Alaric did not ask about lands or titles or the things a real baroness would know without thinking. He asked what she found funny. He asked what she hated about evenings like this one. He asked whether she thought the musicians were any good, and when she said honestly that the violinist was rushing the tempo, he laughed so loudly that 3 nearby guests turned to look. "Nobody has ever criticized my musicians to my face," he said. "I find I do not mind it." "Then you have been surrounded by very polite liars," Alira said. "I have," he agreed. "It is refreshing to meet someone who is not one." The words landed harder than he meant them to, and Alira felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her borrowed shoes. She was, at that very moment, the single largest lie in the entire ballroom, wearing a name that was not hers, occupying a place meant for someone else, and the Duke of Whitmore had just called her refreshingly honest. She smiled anyway. It was easier than explaining. The evening moved forward the way water moves downhill, without asking permission. There was a dance, which she nearly refused before realizing that refusing might draw more attention than accepting. She did not know the steps well, had learned them years ago from watching wealthier women rehearse in dress fittings, but Alaric led with enough confidence that her uncertain footing barely mattered. His hand rested at her waist like a question he was not yet ready to ask aloud. "You dance like someone counting the steps," he said, quiet enough that only she could hear it. "I dance like someone who has not danced in years," she answered, which was, for once, the complete truth. "A baroness who does not dance," he mused. "You are full of surprises tonight." "Perhaps that is why you find me interesting," she said. "A person entirely without surprises would bore you within a week." "Perhaps," he said, and something in his tone told her he was already imagining more than 1 week. Alira's chest tightened with a feeling she did not have time to examine. She reminded herself sharply that this night had a clock on it, that somewhere on a dark road a real baroness with a broken carriage wheel was likely already arranging for a replacement, that dawn would come whether she was ready for it or not, and that everything happening in this ballroom was borrowed, every bit of it, down to the shoes on her feet. But for the length of one dance, she let herself forget the clock entirely. When the music ended, Alaric did not release her hand immediately. "Walk with me," he said, "away from all this noise if only for a few minutes." She should have said no. She understood, even as she nodded, that every minute spent alone with him was a minute in which the truth had more room to slip out, more chances to be noticed. But refusing a duke in front of a room full of witnesses would have drawn exactly the kind of attention she could not survive, and some smaller, more honest part of her did not want to refuse him at all. They stepped out onto a stone terrace overlooking dark gardens, the noise of the ballroom softening behind them into something distant and unimportant. The night air was cool and smelled of rain that had not yet arrived. Alaric leaned against the stone rail and looked at her the way he had looked at her from across the ballroom floor, like a puzzle he was slowly starting to enjoy not solving too quickly. "Tell me something true," he said, "something nobody else in that room knows about you." Alira's mind raced through 100 possible answers, all of them lies dressed up as confessions, the kind of harmless secret a baroness might share to seem charming without risking anything real. But looking at him, at the genuine curiosity in his face, she found she did not want to lie again. Not about this, even if the entire evening around them was built on one enormous lie already. "I am afraid of debt collectors," she said quietly, "more afraid of them than I have ever admitted to anyone." It was true, and it was safe, close enough to honesty to satisfy something in her chest, without giving away the shape of the lie holding the whole night together. Alaric studied her for a long moment, and she thought, with a jolt of fear, that he might ask why a baroness would fear such a thing at all. Instead, something in his expression softened, as though her answer had told him more than the words themselves. "Everyone fears something they cannot control," he said. "I fear rooms exactly like the one behind us, full of people who want something from me and dress it up as affection." "And what do you think I want from you?" she asked, before she could stop herself. He considered the question seriously, which surprised her more than any answer could have. "I do not think you have decided yet," he said, "which is the first honest thing anyone has said to me all evening." The rain that had been threatening all night finally began to fall, light at first, then heavier, sending them both back toward the doors laughing at the sudden cold. As they crossed the threshold back into the noise and light of the ballroom, Alira felt the borrowed name settle over her again like a coat she had not asked to wear but could not yet take off. Somewhere out on the dark road behind the estate, a real baroness was arranging for a new carriage wheel, unaware that her name was already being spoken in rooms she had not yet entered. Somewhere in the city, a debt collector was marking a date on a calendar, unaware that the woman he waited for was standing in a duke's ballroom in a dress meant for someone else. And somewhere inside herself, Alira understood with a clarity that frightened her that she had stopped thinking of tonight as an emergency and started thinking of it as something else entirely, something she was not ready to name. The clock, wherever it was, kept moving. She had until dawn. She intended to make the most of every hour she had left. A maid named Winifred recognized her first. It happened near the refreshment table, an hour after the rain had passed and the ballroom had filled again with the low hum of conversation. Winifred was carrying a tray of glasses, her eyes moving across the room out of habit rather than interest, when they landed on Alira's face and stopped. Alira watched the recognition happen in real time, watched Winifred's expression shift from polite blankness to confusion to something sharper, something that looked dangerously close to certainty. Alira had fitted a dress for Winifred's sister 2 winters ago. It had been a small job, a christening gown, nothing memorable to most people, but Winifred had stood in the shop the entire time, watching every stitch, asking questions about the fabric, remembering, apparently, far more than Alira would have liked. Winifred did not approach. She did not announce anything to the room. She simply stood very still for a moment, the tray trembling slightly in her hands, and then continued walking as though nothing at all had happened. Alira's stomach dropped through the floor. She excused herself from the conversation she had been having with 2 older women discussing their sons, and made her way toward the edge of the room, trying to move at a pace that looked unhurried while her mind raced through every possible outcome. If Winifred said something to a steward, if she said something to a guest, if she said something to Alaric himself, the evening would end within minutes, and not gently. She found Winifred near a service door at the back of the hall, setting down her tray with hands that were no longer steady. "You're the seamstress," Winifred said, quiet, not accusing, simply stating a fact she could not unsee. "From Fenwick Lane, I know you." "You are mistaken," Alira said, and even as the words left her mouth she understood how thin they sounded. Winifred looked at her for a long moment, and something complicated passed across her face. Fear, perhaps, of the trouble that recognizing a fraud might bring down on her own head. Curiosity, certainly, about why a seamstress from Fenwick Lane was standing in a duke's ballroom wearing a baroness's name. But there was something else too, something that looked almost like understanding, as though Winifred herself had once stood at the edge of a room she was not meant to be in, and remembered exactly how it felt. "I fitted my sister's gown at your shop," Winifred said. "You gave us extra thread when we couldn't pay for it. You said it wasn't worth arguing over a few inches of ribbon." Alira's throat tightened. She remembered the gown. She remembered Winifred's sister, thin and nervous, counting coins on the counter that did not add up to the full price, and the christening only 2 days away. "I remember," Alira said quietly, giving up the pretense entirely, at least with this one person. Winifred glanced toward the ballroom, toward the glittering crowd and the music and the Duke somewhere among it all. "I don't know what you're doing here," she said, "and I think it's best I don't ask, but you should know the real Lady Hartley sent word an hour ago. Her carriage wheel is fixed. She's on the road now." The words landed like cold water. "How long?" Alira asked. 3 hours, Winifred said. "Maybe less if the roads have dried enough." 3 hours. Alira had thought she had until dawn, had let herself believe, somewhere in the warm haze of the evening, that dawn was still comfortably far away. 3 hours felt suddenly, brutally short. "Thank you," Alira said, meaning it more than the words could carry, "for not saying anything." Winifred picked up her tray again, some of the steadiness returning to her hands. "I don't forget kindness," she said. "Even small kindness, especially small kindness, but you should leave before she arrives. Whatever this is, it won't end well if you're still here when it isn't yours to be here anymore." She disappeared back into the crowd before Alira could answer, leaving her standing alone near the service door with a clock now ticking loudly in her chest. 3 hours instead of the comfortable, imagined stretch of an entire night. Alira found Alaric again near the far end of the ballroom, deep in conversation with an older man who was clearly attempting to discuss some matter of land or taxation, the kind of conversation dukes were apparently never permitted to escape entirely. Alaric caught her eye across the room, and something in his face changed, some small brightening that he did not seem to notice himself, and Alira felt the 3 hours shrink even further under the weight of that look. She should have used the time to plan her escape. Instead, when he extracted himself from the conversation and crossed the room to find her, she let him lead her toward a quieter corner near the tall windows, and she let herself talk to him again as though the night still stretched out endlessly ahead of them. "You looked troubled a moment ago," he said, standing by the door. "A small matter," Alira said, "nothing worth mentioning." "Everything is worth mentioning, eventually," Alaric said. "I've found that the things people call small are usually the things they're most afraid of." Alira looked at him for a long moment, weighing how much truth she could afford to give him without giving away everything. "I am afraid of running out of time," she said finally. "That is all. It is not a very original fear." "No," he agreed, "but it might be the most honest one in this entire building." They talked about smaller things after that, deliberately smaller, as though both of them understood without saying so that the conversation needed somewhere safer to rest. He told her about a horse he had raised from a foal that refused to be ridden by anyone but him, Stubborn and proud in a way he clearly admired more than he would admit. She told him, carefully edited, about a shop she once knew, about the particular satisfaction of finishing a hem exactly right, about fabric that moved like water under careful hands. She did not say the shop was hers. He did not ask. An hour passed this way, easy and warm, and Alira felt the strange sensation of enjoying herself so thoroughly that she nearly forgot the shrinking clock entirely, until a servant appeared at Alaric's elbow with a folded note. He read it, and something in his posture changed, subtle but immediate, the way a man's shoulders shift when a piece of information rearranges the room around him. "There has been some confusion," he said slowly, looking up from the note. "It seems there may be two versions of Lady Hartley arriving tonight." Alira's heart stopped, then restarted at twice its normal speed. "How strange," she managed. "Strange indeed," Alaric said, watching her now with an expression she could not entirely read, something between amusement and genuine calculation, as though he were turning a puzzle piece over in his hands and finding that it fit somewhere unexpected. "A guard at the gate reports another carriage approaching, also claiming to carry Lady Hartley. The other woman insists she has been delayed by a broken wheel and offers an entirely convincing account of the entire evening's confusion." "How very careless of someone," Alira said, forcing her voice to stay level. "Very careless," Alaric agreed. He did not move away from her. If anything, he leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping to something meant only for the two of them. "I find myself with an interesting decision to make. I could send guards to the gate and sort this confusion out immediately, in front of the entire ballroom, which would no doubt provide excellent entertainment for my more gossip-hungry guests." Alira said nothing. Her pulse hammered so loudly she wondered if he could hear it. "Or," Alaric continued, "I could let the evening continue exactly as it has been, and deal with the matter privately, later, in whatever manner seems least likely to embarrass a guest who has, so far, been the only honest conversation I've had all night." She stared at him, understanding slowly dawning, cold and sharp. "You know," she said quietly, "you've known for some time." "I suspected within the first hour," he said. "You dance like someone who learned by watching. You speak of fabric like someone who has held a needle for a living, not merely admired the results. And Lady Hartley, from everything I have heard of her, is not known for wit or curiosity. You are entirely too interesting to be her." Alira felt the floor tilt again, more violently this time. "Why say nothing?" she whispered. "Why let me stay?" Alaric was quiet for a moment, studying her face as though searching for the right words among several less honest options. "Because for the first time in longer than I care to admit," he said finally, "someone in this house was speaking to me rather than to my title. I was not ready for that to end." The music swelled somewhere behind them, the evening moving forward with a rhythm entirely indifferent to the private earthquake happening between the two of them near the tall windows. Alira felt something crack open in her chest, something that had nothing to do with debt or borrowed names or dawn approaching faster than she was ready for. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Alaric said, "I suggest we find somewhere quieter to finish this conversation, before the real Lady Hartley arrives and makes the choice for both of us." He offered his arm, and Alira, against every fragment of caution left in her body, took it. Behind them, at the far end of the drive, a second carriage was already turning through the gates, its lanterns cutting through the dark like a countdown neither of them could stop. The second carriage did not stop at the front steps. Alaric had given quiet instructions to a steward before leading Alira away from the ballroom, and the carriage carrying the real Lady Hartley was redirected instead to a side entrance, where a different steward would greet her with apologies about a mix-up in the guest arrangements, offer her refreshment, and delay her, for as long as possible, from entering the main hall. It would not buy much time, perhaps 20 minutes. Perhaps less, if the real Baroness proved impatient, which by all accounts she was known to be. Alira followed Alaric down a narrow corridor lit by candles instead of the grand chandeliers of the ballroom, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to watch her pass with open disapproval. Her heart had not slowed since the moment he told her he knew. If anything, it beat harder now, faster, caught somewhere between terror and a feeling she did not have a name for yet. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere private," Alaric said, "where 20 minutes might actually mean something." He led her into a small study, shelves of books rising to the ceiling, a fire burning low in the grate, the noise of the ballroom reduced to a distant murmur through the thick walls. He closed the door behind them and for a moment simply looked at her, as though trying to see past the borrowed dress and the borrowed name to whoever was actually standing in front of him. "Alira," he said, "is that even your real name?" "It is," she said. "The rest was a lie. My name is Alira Bennett. I own a dress shop on Fenwick Lane. I was delivering Lady Hartley's gown when my carriage wheel broke, and your footman mistook me for the woman I was meant to be serving." Saying it aloud felt like setting down something impossibly heavy. She had been carrying the lie so carefully all evening, weighing every word before she spoke it, and now that it was finally out in the open, she felt lighter and more exposed at the same time, as though she had removed a layer of armor she had not realized she was wearing. Alaric did not look surprised. If anything, he looked relieved, the same way she felt, as though the truth had been sitting between them for hours, waiting for permission to exist. "Why did you not correct the footman?" he asked, "at the very start before any of this happened?" Alira hesitated. This was the part of the truth she had not planned to share, the part that made her sound desperate rather than simply mistaken. But something about the small study, the low fire, the way he was looking at her without judgment, made the words come easier than she expected. "Because I owe money I cannot pay," she said. "A debt collector has been standing outside my shop for 3 days. I have 4 days left before he takes what little I have and closes the shop entirely. When your footman called me Lady Hartley, I saw one warm, well-fed evening where nobody could reach me. I am not proud of the choice, but I made it anyway." Alaric crossed the room slowly and sat in the chair opposite hers, close enough that she could see every small shift in his expression. "How much do you owe?" he asked. "That is not why I told you," Alira said quickly, something sharp rising in her chest. "I did not say it so you would offer to fix it. I said it because you asked, and because I am tired of lying to you tonight." "I did not assume you wanted rescuing," Alaric said, his voice gentle but firm. "I asked because I wanted to understand the shape of the trouble you are in. There is a difference between offering help and simply wanting to know a person completely, including the parts that frighten them." Alira felt something in her chest loosen, just slightly, at the distinction. £240, she said quietly. "It sounds like a small number to a man who owns an estate like this one. It has felt like the entire world to me for the last 3 months." "It is not a small number," Alaric said. "Numbers are only small or large depending on who is asked to carry them." They sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling low between them, the distant music from the ballroom drifting faintly through the walls like something happening in another world entirely. Alira studied his face, trying to memorize it, aware suddenly that whatever happened next, whatever the rest of this strange night held, she would likely never see this room, this fire, this particular version of his expression again. "Tell me about the shop," Alaric said, "not the debt." "The shop itself, what made you choose it?" Alira found herself smiling before she realized she was doing it. "My mother was a seamstress. I grew up watching her hands move across fabric like she was having a conversation with it. When she died, I inherited her needles and her debts in equal measure. The shop was the only thing that felt like her that I could still hold on to. I have spent 6 years trying to keep it alive, mostly out of stubbornness, partly because I do not know who I would be without it." "That does not sound like stubbornness," Alaric said. That sounds like devotion. Sometimes those are the same thing, Alira said, especially when the world keeps insisting you should give up. Alaric leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away and made her want, at the same time, to never look away again. I have spent my entire life being told what I should want, he said. A wife chosen for her family's holdings, friendships chosen for their political usefulness. Even this ball tonight was arranged by my steward as an opportunity to be introduced to 3 separate women my mother considers suitable matches. I did not choose a single guest on that list. I did not choose you either. And yet you are the only person in that entire ballroom I have wanted to talk to all night. Alira's breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. I am not someone you can choose, she said quietly. I am a seamstress with a debt and a false name and a carriage that will not be fixed until morning. Whatever this is, it ends the moment the real Lady Hartley walks through your door. Does it have to end? Alaric asked, and the question hung in the air between them, fragile and dangerous, the kind of question that could not be unasked once it had been spoken aloud. Before Alira could answer, a sharp knock sounded at the study door and a steward's voice came through, tight with urgency. Your Grace, Lady Hartley has arrived and is asking to be received immediately. She is not pleased with the delay. Alaric closed his eyes briefly, the weight of the entire evening settling back onto his shoulders in an instant. When he opened them again, the softness from a moment ago had been replaced with something harder, more calculating, the expression of a man who had spent his whole life managing crises before they became visible to anyone else. I need a few minutes, he said, standing. Stay here. Do not go back into the ballroom. I will find a way to explain the confusion without exposing you, but I need time to think of something that will hold together under questioning. Alaric, Alira said, standing as well, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to keep it steady. You do not owe me protection. I created this mess. I can find my own way out of it. I am not offering because I owe you anything, he said, crossing the small distance between them and taking her hands in his, an act far more intimate than anything that had happened between them in the ballroom, where 100 eyes might have been watching. I am offering because I want to. There is a difference, Alira. I would like you to remember that difference, whatever happens in the next hour. He left the study before she could respond, his footsteps fading quickly down the corridor, leaving her alone with the fire and the portraits and the sudden, overwhelming silence of a room built for exactly this kind of waiting. Alira sank back into the chair, her hands still warm from his, her mind racing through every possible outcome of the next hour. If the real Lady Hartley discovered the deception, there would be no explanation elegant enough to prevent scandal. A duke's household caught harboring an impostor at a formal event was the kind of story that traveled fast and cruelly, the kind of story that would not merely cost Alira her freedom but would cost Alaric something far more valuable in his world, the trust and respect of the people whose opinions shaped his entire existence. She thought of leaving immediately, of finding a servant's exit and vanishing into the dark before any of it could unravel further. It would be the sensible choice, the choice her mother, practical to the end, would have advised without hesitation. Do not linger in a house on fire, however warm the flames might feel. But she found, sitting in that small study with the fire burning low and Alaric's warmth still lingering in her hands, that she did not want to leave without knowing how the night ended. Not for the shop, not for the debt, which £240 could not solve in an evening regardless of what happened next, but for herself, for the strange, unfamiliar feeling of being seen so completely by someone who had every reason to look away and had chosen not to. She stood crossed to the window and looked out over the dark gardens where she and Alaric had stood together earlier in the rain. Somewhere beyond those gardens, past the gates, her real life waited with all its ordinary weight, the shop, the debt, the uncertain future. But for now, for this fragile stretch of borrowed time, she remained inside the warm walls of a house that was not hers, wearing a name that was not hers, waiting to learn whether the truth, once loose in the world, could be survived. Voices rose faintly down the corridor, one of them sharp and demanding, unmistakably a woman accustomed to being obeyed without question. Elira's pulse quickened. The real Lady Hartley had arrived, and whatever careful explanation Alaric had constructed was about to be tested in the worst possible way, in front of an audience that would not forgive a mistake. Elira pressed her palm against the cool glass of the window and waited, every nerve in her body strung tight, for the sound of footsteps returning down the hall, unable to tell whether they would bring rescue or ruin. The footsteps that finally approached the study door were slow and measured, nothing like the sharp, hurried pace Elira had expected. She turned from the window as the door opened, and Alaric stepped inside alone, closing it quietly behind him. "She has been settled in the east drawing room," he said. Furious, tired from the road, and thoroughly convinced that a scheduling error at my steward's hand caused the entire confusion, I apologized extensively. She has requested an early night and has asked not to be disturbed until morning. Relief flooded through Elira so suddenly her knees nearly buckled. She did not ask to see the ballroom, to meet the other guests. She asked only for a hot meal and a quiet room, Alaric said. Apparently the broken wheel and the long delay have left her in no mood for company. I intend to make certain nothing changes her mind before dawn. Elira let out a breath she felt she had been holding for the better part of an hour. "Then it worked," she said. "Whatever you told her, it worked." "For now," Alaric said, though his expression remained careful, unwilling to celebrate too soon. "But she will wake in the morning, Elira, and she will eventually meet people who attended tonight and speak of a Lady Hartley who charmed half the ballroom and danced with the Duke. Questions will follow. I cannot promise they will not." The warmth of relief cooled slightly under the weight of that truth. Elira sat back down in the chair by the fire, suddenly aware of how tired she was, the exhaustion of the entire strange evening finally catching up with her all at once. "Then I should leave before morning," she said, "before there is any chance of those questions finding me still standing in your house." Alaric crossed the room and knelt in front of her chair, close enough that she could see the flicker of firelight in his eyes. "I do not want you to leave," he said, quiet and direct, none of the careful diplomacy he had used with the real Lady Hartley moments before. "But I understand why you feel you must." "It is not a matter of feeling," Elira said. "It is a matter of consequence. I have already put you at risk simply by staying this long. Every hour I remain is another hour that could unravel everything you have built tonight to protect us both." "Let me help you," Alaric said. "Not out of guilt and not because you asked me to. I want to see the debt settled. I want to see your shop safe. Call it selfish if you like. I find I am not ready for this evening to be the only evening we ever share." Elira felt tears gather unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, and she blinked them back, unwilling to let the weight of the entire night finally break something open in front of him. "You barely know me," she said. "A few hours in a ballroom and a study does not make you responsible for my debts." "No," Alaric agreed, "but it has made me want to know more, and wanting to know more means wanting you to still have a shop and a home, and a life free of a debt collector's shadow when I come looking for you." "You would come looking for me," Elira repeated, testing the words, uncertain whether to believe them. "I would," Alaric said simply, "if you would allow it." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for the practiced charm she had expected from a man of his position, the kind of smooth promise made easily and forgotten just as easily once the night had ended. She did not find it. What she found instead was something steadier, something that looked in the low firelight remarkably like sincerity. "There is a coach house behind the eastern wall," Alaric said, standing and offering his hand to help her from the chair. "My driver can take you back to Fenwick Lane before the household wakes. I will send funds to settle the debt discreetly tomorrow, in a manner that will not draw questions, through a solicitor rather than directly, so no one need know where the money came from unless you choose to tell them. Alaric, Alira started, but he shook his head gently, cutting off the protest before it could fully form. "Let me do this," he said, "not as payment for anything, and not as an obligation you owe me in return. Simply because I can, and because I want to, and because some debts in this life are worth settling for no reason beyond decency." Alira felt something in her chest crack open entirely this time. The careful walls she had built over 6 years of managing alone, finally giving way under the simple, overwhelming force of being offered help without condition. She had spent so long expecting every kindness to carry a hidden cost that she had forgotten what it felt like to receive one that did not. "Thank you," she whispered, and the words felt inadequate for the size of what he was offering, but they were the only words she had left. They walked together through a servants' corridor toward the eastern wall, past sleeping kitchens and dark storerooms, the noise of the ballroom fading further behind them with every step. The night air outside was cold and clean, the rain long since passed, stars scattered thickly across a sky that seemed, for a moment, entirely too vast for the small, fragile thing happening between them. A coach waited in the yard, its driver already alert despite the late hour, clearly accustomed to being summoned without warning for matters his employer preferred to keep quiet. Alaric helped Alira up into the coach himself, his hand lingering in hers a moment longer than necessary. "I do not know your address," he said. "I know only Fenwick Lane." "The shop with the blue door," Alira said. "Bennett's, though the sign has faded so badly you can barely read the name anymore. I have been meaning to repaint it for 2 years." "Then I will find it," Alaric said, "blue door and all." "And if the real Lady Hartley discovers everything tomorrow?" Alira asked, unable to keep the fear entirely from her voice. "If your careful story falls apart in daylight?" "Then it falls apart," Alaric said, with more calm than Alira thought the situation deserved. "I have weathered worse scandals than a mistaken identity at a ball. What I could not weather easily is watching you disappear tonight without any way to find you again." The driver climbed up to his seat, the horses shifting restlessly in their harnesses, sensing the approach of departure. Alira leaned forward in the coach doorway, searching Alaric's face one last time, trying to memorize every detail of the man standing in the cold yard in the hour before dawn, dressed like a duke but looking, in that unguarded moment, simply like a man who did not want to say goodbye. "Before I leave," she said, "answer one question honestly." "Anything," he said. "When did you truly know, not suspect, know?" Alaric was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same careful attention he had given every question that night. "The moment you criticized my violinist," he said finally. "No baroness raised for a life of polite silence would have risked offending a duke's musicians on a first meeting. Only someone who had spent her life speaking honestly, because honesty was the only thing she could afford." Alira laughed despite herself, a sound caught somewhere between amusement and the ache of an evening that was ending far too quickly. "I nearly did not say it," she admitted. "I almost swallowed the comment and smiled instead, the way everyone else in that room seemed to." "I am glad you did not," Alaric said. "It was the first true thing anyone said to me all evening. I have been chasing the rest of the truth ever since." The driver cleared his throat gently, a small, respectful reminder that the sky was already beginning to lighten faintly at its edges, that dawn was closer than either of them wanted to admit. Alaric stepped back from the coach door, though his hand remained lifted, as though reluctant to let the moment end. "Go safely," he said. "I will find you, I promise you that." "And if you do not?" Alira asked, unable to stop the question, needing somehow to hear how he would answer it. "Then you will have had one honest night," Alaric said, "in a life that has, by your own account, had far too few of them. I hope it was worth the risk." "It was," Alira said, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. Whatever happens after this, it was worth it. The driver flicked the reins, and the coach began to move, wheels turning slowly at first across the gravel yard before picking up speed toward the estate gates. Alira watched Alaric grow smaller through the small rear window, standing alone in the gray light before dawn, one hand still raised, until the coach turned onto the main road and the estate disappeared entirely behind a line of dark trees. She sat back against the worn seat cushions, her heart pounding with a mixture of exhaustion and something she did not yet have the courage to call hope. Somewhere behind her, in a great house full of sleeping guests and one furious, unsuspecting baroness, an entire night's worth of careful lies remained balanced on the edge of discovery. Somewhere ahead of her, past the fatting dark of the countryside, her ordinary life waited, the shop with the faded blue door, the debt that might, impossibly, already be settled by morning, and no certainty at all about whether a duke's promise, made in the last hour before sunrise, could survive contact with daylight. She closed her eyes as the coach rattled on toward Fenwick Lane, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to imagine a future that did not begin and end with fear. The shop with the blue door looked smaller than Alira remembered when the coach finally stopped in front of it, the faded paint even more worn in the gray light of early morning than it had seemed in her memory. She climbed down from the coach with legs still unsteady from the long ride, thanked the driver, and watched him turn the horses back toward the estate before she allowed herself to breathe fully for what felt like the first time all night. Inside, the shop was cold and quiet, exactly as she had left it, bolts of fabric stacked along the walls, her mother's old sewing table still bearing the faint scorch mark from a candle knocked over years ago. She sat down at the table, still wearing the borrowed gown, and allowed herself, finally, to cry, though whether from exhaustion, relief, or the strange ache of missing someone she had known for only a single night, she could not entirely say. She slept through most of the following day, waking only when a sharp knock sounded at the shop door in the late afternoon. Her stomach clenched instinctively, certain it was the debt collector returned early. But when she opened the door, she found instead a solicitor's clerk, formal and unfamiliar, holding a sealed envelope with her name written across the front in careful, unhurried handwriting. Inside was a banknote for £250, 10 more than the debt itself required, along with a single line, unsigned, that read only, "For the shop and the door that needs repainting." Alira sat down heavily on the shop floor, the note clutched in her hand, and laughed until the laughter turned, without warning, into tears again. The debt collector did not return. When she sought him out herself the following morning, prepared for an argument, he accepted the payment with visible surprise and left without another word. The matter closed as quickly and quietly as it had once seemed impossible to close at all. Word arrived from the estate 3 days later, not from Alaric directly, but through the same solicitor's clerk, informing her only that the household had weathered a brief period of gossip regarding a confusion at the ball, quickly smoothed over, and that Lady Hartley had returned to her own estate none the wiser about the true events of that particular evening. There was no mention of when, or whether, the Duke intended to visit Fenwick Lane himself. Weeks passed. Alira repainted the shop door a deep, defiant blue, brighter than before, and told herself the color had nothing to do with the promise made in a cold yard before dawn. Business improved slowly but steadily, word of a skilled seamstress with unusually fine work spreading through the surrounding streets, though she suspected some of that word may have originated from Winifred, who visited twice in the following month, always with some small excuse about mending, always with a knowing look that Alira chose not to question too closely. She did not allow herself to hope, not really, not out loud. Dukes did not visit seamstresses. Promises made in the exhausted, unguarded hour before dawn rarely survived the return of ordinary daylight, and Alira had learned long ago not to build her life around the rare exception rather than the common rule. And yet, some part of her waited anyway. She found herself glancing toward the door each time the bell above it rang, found herself standing a little straighter whenever a fine carriage passed along the street outside, found herself, more than once, replaying the exact sound of his voice saying he would find her, and wondering how long a person could reasonably wait before accepting that a promise had simply been the kind thing to say in the moment, rather than a thing meant to be kept. 6 weeks after the ball, on an unremarkable gray afternoon with rain threatening at the edges of the sky, the bell above the shop door rang while Elira was kneeling on the floor, pinning the hem of a customer's dress. She did not look up immediately, focused on the careful line of pins, murmuring an apology for the delay and asking whoever had entered to wait just a moment. "Take whatever time you need," said a voice she recognized instantly, warm and familiar even after 6 weeks of silence. "I find I am in no particular hurry." Elira's hands stilled on the fabric. She looked up slowly, half convinced exhaustion was conjuring the voice out of nothing, and found Alaric standing just inside the blue door, dressed plainly, without any of the finery of that first night, looking somehow more like himself for the absence of it. "You are late," she said, before she could think of anything more composed to say, her voice unsteady with a mixture of disbelief and something far warmer than disbelief. "I am," he agreed, a small smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "There were matters at the estate that required my attention, and I confess I was not entirely certain of my welcome, given how our last conversation ended in such uncertain terms." Elira set down her pins carefully, aware of her customer watching the entire exchange with undisguised curiosity, and rose to her feet, smoothing her simple work dress with hands that trembled slightly despite her best efforts to steady them. "I painted the door," she said, gesturing awkwardly toward the entrance, unable to think of anything more meaningful to say in the sudden, overwhelming rush of the moment. "I noticed," Alaric said. "It suits the shop far better than the faded version. I am glad you kept the money for its intended purpose, rather than assuming, as I half feared you might, that pride would send it back to me unspent." "I considered it," Elira admitted. "Pride nearly won, but the shop needed it more than my pride did in the end." Her customer, a woman Elira recognized as a regular from 2 streets over, cleared her throat pointedly, clearly recognizing that whatever conversation was unfolding required considerably more privacy than her half-pinned hem allowed. "I believe I can return another day," she said, already gathering her things with poorly concealed amusement. "This seems like a conversation that has waited long enough already." She left quickly, the bell ringing once more behind her, leaving Elira and Alaric alone in the small shop, surrounded by bolts of fabric and the quiet, settling dust of an ordinary afternoon that had, without warning, become something else entirely. "I did not know if you would come," Elira said, once the silence had stretched long enough that someone needed to break it. 6 weeks is a long time for a promise made in the dark." "I know," Alaric said, "and I am sorry for the delay truly. But I did not want to arrive with nothing more to offer than a repeated promise. I wanted to arrive with something settled, something certain, so that, when I asked you the question I came here to ask, you would understand it was not another impulsive decision made in the strange excitement of a single night." Elira's breath caught. "What question?" Alaric crossed the small shop floor until he stood directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the faint exhaustion around his eyes, the mark of a man who had spent 6 weeks working through obligations she could not begin to imagine in order to arrive, finally, at this particular afternoon. "I do not intend to ask you to become a baroness or a duchess or anyone other than exactly who you already are," he said. "I have had 6 weeks to consider what I actually want, separate from titles and estates and everything my family expects of me, and what I have concluded is remarkably simple. I want to know you properly. Not across a ballroom under a false name, not in a single stolen night before dawn, but in ordinary daylight, over ordinary weeks, for as long as it takes to determine whether what began under false circumstances can become something honestly built, one true day at a time. Alira felt tears rise again, though this time they carried none of the desperate exhaustion of that first night, only something lighter, something that felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely hopeful. "You came all this way to ask permission to visit me properly," she said, half laughing through the tears threatening to spill over. "A duke, asking a seamstress if he may court her honestly." "When you say it that way, it sounds absurdly simple," Alaric said, though his own smile suggested he found nothing absurd about it at all. "But yes, that is precisely what I am asking." "Then yes," Alira said, without hesitation, the word arriving easily, naturally, as though it had been waiting inside her for 6 entire weeks for exactly this moment to be spoken aloud. "Properly and honestly and in ordinary daylight. I would like that very much." Alaric's smile widened into something unguarded and genuinely relieved, the careful composure of a duke giving way, for just a moment, to the simple happiness of a man who had got the answer he had traveled a long distance hoping to hear. He reached out and took her hand, not with the formal courtesy of a ballroom dance, but with the easy familiarity of someone who intended to keep holding it for a long time to come. "I should warn you," he said, "my mother will have opinions about a duke courting a seamstress, extensive opinions delivered at considerable length." "I have survived a debt collector," Alira said. "I imagine I can survive your mother's opinions as well." "I do not doubt it," Alaric said. "You survived an entire evening pretending to be someone else, in a room full of people trained from birth to detect exactly that kind of deception. My mother's disapproval will seem gentle by comparison." They stood together in the small shop as the afternoon light shifted outside the window, the rain that had threatened all day finally beginning to fall, softly this time, without the urgency of that first stormy night at the estate. Alira thought of the ballroom, the mistaken name, the borrowed gown, the entire strange chain of small accidents that had led, improbably, to this exact moment, standing in her mother's old shop with a duke's hand in hers, and found she could not bring herself to regret a single moment of the deception that had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, led her here. "I never did properly explain how the wheel broke," she said, half laughing at the memory now that it no longer carried any danger. "It was the smallest crack in the axle. I nearly did not notice it before it gave out entirely." "The smallest things often carry the largest consequences," Alaric said. "A cracked wheel, a mistaken name, a single honest comment about a violinist's poor timing. I find I am grateful for every one of them." Outside, the rain continued to fall gently over Fenwick Lane, over the newly painted blue door, over a shop that had nearly been lost to debt, and was instead, improbably, becoming the beginning of something else entirely. Alira looked at the man standing in front of her, still faintly disbelieving that the promise made in the cold hour before dawn had actually survived the return of daylight, and allowed herself, finally and completely, to believe in it. Whatever came next, whatever challenges his mother's opinions or society's judgment might bring, she understood now that the version of herself who had walked nervously into that ballroom wearing a stranger's name had, somewhere in the course of one long, impossible night, found something far more valuable than a single evening of borrowed comfort. She had found someone willing to see past the name entirely, to the person actually standing beneath it, and to choose that person, deliberately and in full daylight, without needing a single lie to make the choosing easier. The rain fell softly against the blue door of Bennett's, and inside, the shop that had nearly closed forever stood instead as the quiet beginning of an entirely different kind of story, one neither of them intended to rush, and both of them, for the first time, felt no need to hide from at all.